Hello, and welcome back to River Rock Restoration, and this is our study of the Bible study that I did several years back. It's called Isaiah, a Biblical Microcosm, and this is a hard copy of it. And I'm just taking everyone who's watching through a video series, chapter by chapter, or in this case, we do a couple of chapters at a time. Today's session is going to be Ezra and Nehemiah, which are books 15 and 16, and how they correlate to Isaiah chapters 15 and 16. And so I'm just going to get right to it, and let me make sure I have this set up right. Yep. Okay, so here is book 15, chapter 15. This is Ezra, and book 15, and that's correlating again to Isaiah chapter 15. And it's another, we have another numerology curiosity very similar to what we saw in book 13. And it's kind of a multi-layered connection. So you see it in book 12 with chapter 12, book 14 with chapter 14, and book 13, book 15, chapter 15, and so on. So you're going to see that as we get into the text down here, which I normally don't do, but I'm going to do it for this session. Okay, so here's the chapter and verse, Ezra 9:3, and it says, "And when I heard about this matter, I tore my garment and my robe, and pulled some of the hair from my head and my beard, and sat down appalled." And of course, what Ezra is talking about here is the intermarrying that went on with the pagan nations, the women of the pagan nations that were there in the midst and surrounding. And so when he heard about what had happened, because they were in a religious sense, but also in a genetic sense, they were, at that time they were supposed to only marry Jews and or proselytes who had converted to the Judaic faith. So that was very important, and when they had just abandoned that concept, that precept, that established order of the way they were supposed to do things, they were not supposed to intermarry. God told them in the law that they were not supposed to do that with the surrounding pagan nations. They could, however, marry a proselyte who became a believer. That they could do. But this is the context of what Ezra is dealing with. And he says, "And when I heard about this matter, I tore my garment and my robe, and pulled some of the hair out from my head and my beard, and sat down appalled." Okay, so that's Ezra, the 15th book of the Bible. Here in Isaiah chapter 15, for the second half of verse 2, it says, "Everyone's head is bald, and every beard is cut off." So here you could see he pulled some of the hair from his head and his beard, and here everyone's head is completely bald and every beard is completely cut off. So again, we see that numerology connection. We talked about, this being the 15th book and the 15th chapter. Well, it just so happens that the word beard is only mentioned 15 times in the entire Bible. And here in book 15 and chapter 15, beard appears in the sense of being ripped out. So again, that's one of the things I started noticing throughout this study, that the number of times a word is used, because that's honestly, many of these connections were sometimes very subtle and hard to find, and I had to read through the book. Sometimes, in some cases, I think the worst one, I had to read through the book about 25, 30, 35 times, very carefully, verse by verse, and then compare it to that particular Isaiah chapter, because the connection was very obscure or not easy to find. So a technique that I developed was to help me find connections that might be there that I might otherwise gloss over, was I went through a concordance and I started looking at, okay, well, let me find a key word here that I can focus on, and I would find a word, and then I would go through and see if that same word appeared in the Isaiah chapter and in that particular book of the Bible. So a number of times I found that, and very interestingly, when I did find that happen, it seems to always be in a sense where that word was very rare throughout the entire Bible. It hardly ever appeared in the whole Bible. Sometimes it was only like 3 times in the whole Bible, and the two of those three were in the specific book and in its corresponding Isaiah chapter. So I think that just adds further confirmation to God's divine order and organization to indexing and making His word exactly the way He intended it to be. Okay, so I also wanted to get into a little bit of the commentary here on this as well for this one. Again, Ezra pulls out some of his hair, and here it is. Some of his beard, while in Isaiah everyone's head is completely bald and everyone's beard is completely cut off. And this indicates or is indicative of climactic parallelism. And I did a session on parallelism and how that works earlier in the series, so you can go back and check that out if you didn't see that particular video. But it's where a statement is made and then deepens with the quantity of people the statement affects from just one to everyone, along with a higher level of intensity of what is happening, from some hair and some beard being pulled out to complete baldness and completely cut off. So that is indicative of, even though it's across not subsequent verses, it's lateral in the sense that it's parallelism between a corresponding Bible book in its ordered number and a corresponding verse. Okay, so we're also, since that one was there was only one connection that I was able to find in Ezra, and so I decided to go ahead and also add Nehemiah to this video. So that is book 16 and chapter 16. And so this one's kind of hard. This is a unique one because the connection here also was very difficult to find, and it was very subtle. But once it finally hit me, I saw that I had to take the whole passage from the entire passage from the Isaiah passage and kind of keep repeating it and how it relates to the Nehemiah account. So you'll see this. I basically just keep repeating this over and over again. Isaiah 16:1 through, let's see, through verse 3. So that's the passage, and it just keeps repeating over and over again. And then each one of these aspects of this passage corresponds to a different section in Nehemiah. So the way I did it is I just kind of, I highlight this so you can kind of see what is being paralleled here. So this is those who have been scattered. So this first one is going to be the scattered. So that happens to be this one, scattered nest. Okay. So where it says, send the tribute lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah by way of the wilderness to the mountain of the daughter of Zion. Then, like fleeing birds scattered nest, the daughters of Moab will be at the fords of the Arnon. Bring advice, make a decision, set your shadow like night in the midst of the noon. Hide the outcast, do not betray the fugitive. So the bolded words, which are my emphasis here, I'm just putting those in bold so that you can see how they correlate to the corresponding Nehemiah passage. So in this case, we're highlighting scattered, and so that is then like fleeing birds, scattered nest. Okay, and so here in Nehemiah 1:9 it says, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. And of course, this is speaking of God speaking here about the fact that there's a diaspora, there's a dispersion, and that He, though, is going to regather the Jews back into their land, ultimately back to Jerusalem, where He's caused His name to dwell. And so here again, Nehemiah is doing what? They're about to come back into the land from Babylon. The process has already been started, but it happens in stages, and Nehemiah is the one that goes and actually rebuilds the city walls with his contingent of helpers that join him in that effort. Okay, so they're going to come back, ultimately back into Israel, back to Jerusalem, and so here it's like fleeing birds scattered nest, and then here those of you who have been scattered, even to the remotest part of the heavens, will be regathered. Okay, and this is kind of an interesting connection, but if you think of Moab here, instead of Israel, Moab is mentioned. However, we know that Ruth, who is our Gentile bride, representing the church in the rapture, is a Moabitess. And so, even though that gets back to what we were talking about in Ezra, because remember that Ruth was a Moabitess, so she was prohibited from marrying Boaz as a Moabitess. But if you read Ruth carefully, you'll see that Ruth has a conversion experience. She tells Naomi that, no, I'm going to stay with you because I believe in your God, and your people are going to be my people, and your God is going to be my God. I believe in your ways and your God's ways and your people's ways, and I'm going to become an Israelite. And so Ruth, because she had converted in her heart to become a believer in the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, she becomes a full-fledged Israelite who Boaz is able to marry. So I thought that was also interesting. All right, so going on, here's the next one. So again, this is going to be the same exact Isaiah 16 passage, and you could see how it's bolded in the same exact way as before, only this time we're talking about the lamb, right? So it says, send the tribute lamb to the ruler of the land. Okay, well, in Nehemiah 2, chapter 1, and it came about in the month Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, wine was before him, and I took wine and gave to the king, and I had not been sat in his presence, and it goes on and on, and it goes on to explain how, if you keep going and reading here, the word lamb isn't used. However, it's saying to send the tribute lamb. So the king said to me, the queen sitting with him, how long will your journey be, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I probably should have bolded the send there, but send me, and I gave him a definite time. So Nehemiah is like a representative going to do this great work of rebuilding Jerusalem. So, here you have send the lamb, and here, it pleased the king to send me. So again, I should have bolded the send there, but I think you get the point. Next one, Nehemiah sets his shadow. Okay, so the key word here is shadow, like night in the midst of the noon. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. And so that's on the Isaiah chapter 16, verse 3. In this case, it says, bring advice, make a decision, and then also here, in bold, set your shadow like night in the midst of the noon. Okay, so let's go and read this in Nehemiah 2:1. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days, and I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my heart to do for Jerusalem. So again, he's doing something kind of in secret. There was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding, so I went out at night. So again, you see here, set your shadow like night in the midst of the noon. By the valley gate in the direction of the dragon's well, and on to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up again at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again and returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, and the officials of the rest who did the work. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about that one in just a moment, but just kind of keep that in mind, that he's doing this in secret. Okay, so this is kind of like and you can see, hide the outcast, do not betray the fugitive. So basically, this is a way of saying of doing something in secret, because if you set your shadow like night in the midst of the noon, it basically is a poetic way of saying, at noon the sun is directly overhead, so you should cast no shadow. So it's a way of saying doing something in secret, just like at night you essentially have no shadow, unless it's a an extraordinarily bright moon or something, but that's not the, we're not being that technical here. We're being more looking at the poetic way the language is. Okay, so Nehemiah gives advice and makes a decision with the people to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, okay, or the city. So this one, we're mainly focusing on gives advice and make a decision. Okay, so look at that. So we're going to go down here again, and it says in verse 3 again, bring advice, make a decision. Okay, so let's look now at Nehemiah 2:17. Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire? Okay, come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. So he's bringing advice. And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words, which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. So again, Nehemiah brought advice, and they, based on his advice, made the decision to do what he said. Okay, so again, since this one is a little bit obscure, let me go over this one in a little bit more detail. So again, where it says, set your shadow like night in the midst of the noon, could have several meanings. It depends on whether it is like night in the midst of the noon, in other words, making a very dark shadow and a very bright light, or it could mean like night in the midst of the noon, since at noon there is no shadow cast from the sun because the sun is directly overhead. Either way, the metaphor implies doing something without leaving a trace, which is how Nehemiah goes out at night without a trace to inspect the walls and the gates of Jerusalem. Okay, then he brings advice and helps the people make that decision, like the next one says. Okay, and then there's another Nehemiah connection, which is separate from that cluster of connections. And this one is in Nehemiah 5:3, and it says, and there were others who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses that we might get grain because of the famine. Also, there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and on our vineyards. And now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, and our children like children. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters are forced into bondage. And there is not the power in our hands, because our fields and vineyards belong to others. Okay, and then so this connection here in Isaiah 16:9, it says, for the shouting over your summer fruits and your harvest has fallen away, and gladness and joy are taken away from the fruitful field and the vineyards. Also there will be no cries of joy or jubilant shouting, nor treader treads out wine in the presses, for I have made the shouting to cease. So you can see in this connection, again, in Nehemiah, there is a lament by the Jews in Jerusalem over the fields and vineyards that have been sold to pay taxes and usury to their Jewish brethren. In Isaiah 16:9 and 10, there's a parallel of lament over the gladness and joy being taken away from the fruitful fields and vineyards, except that in Isaiah, it is in the context of the fields and vineyards of the people of Moab, who are being punished for their pride, arrogance, fury, and boastfulness. In the passages after Nehemiah 5:3-5, the joy is restored to the fields and vineyards of the people of Jerusalem. Whereas in Isaiah, Moab is degraded further until his remnant becomes very small. And you can reference Isaiah 16:14 for that. Okay, and actually, one more here. In Nehemiah 1:2, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. That's at the very beginning. That's the way Nehemiah opens in the first few verses. Okay, then Isaiah 16:14 says, but now the Lord speaks, saying, within 3 years, as a hired man would count them, the glory of Moab will be degraded along with all his great population, and his remnant will be very small and impotent. So again, we already kind of covered that in this commentary here in advance. But again, we're contrasting Moab, the contrast there of Moab, and the contrast of how that applies to the Jews that are experiencing these very parallel, similar laments and difficulties as the Moabite nation. Okay, so let me just go over this one as well. Interesting to note here that the book of Nehemiah starts with Nehemiah inquiring about the remnant of Judah and Jerusalem. He is told they're in great distress and reproach. Then, through Nehemiah and the humility and obedience of the people of Jerusalem, God works to restore Jerusalem and its remnant to new life and abundance. Isaiah chapter 16 ends with Moab, after having great abundance and prideful boasting of their abundance, they're being left in distress and reproach with a very small remnant without hope of renewal because they will be impotent. All right. And so that's the end of the Ezra and Nehemiah section. Next one will be Esther. I'll probably do that as a single. I'm trying to keep these videos relatively short so they're easier to digest. So I hope you enjoyed this particular session, and I will see you in the next video. God bless you.